Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you all are joining from. My name is Masoud, and I'm part of AI Advisory at SAS Canada, and I'll be your happy moderator today. Panelists Piotr and Prashant, thank you for joining. I cannot wait to get our conversation started on the governance of AI. It is such a multidimensional topic. We're going to talk about regulation, legislation. There's a conversation of fairness. There's ethics. So let's see how deep we can go today. But first, Piotr and Prashant, let's get started with some introductions. Prashant, please go ahead.
Yes, hey, thanks everybody for joining. I'm Prashant Sharma. I'm a co-founder and CTO for data privacy venture called Secuvy. We are located here in California. And before this, I've done several AI-related products at companies like Salesforce and Oracle, and glad to be here.
Excellent. And for myself, Piotr Mierzejewski, I'm Executive Director of Development of DB2 and Big Data at IBM. Prior to that gig, I was actually dealing with building our machine learning platforms. So I have been intertwined in the whole evolution of AI and ML for the last 4 or 5 years. Excited to be here. Maya, guys, let's kick it off.
Let's do it. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a loaded question. I mentioned fairness earlier. It's a term that's coming up a lot. I'm using it a lot. So my question is, how can fairness be evaluated? And that could be defined, measured, or controlled. How can fairness be evaluated in AI systems? And Prashant, we can start with you.
Yes, so very tricky question, very hard to define. It's basically like how I have done it in the past, like what is fair and what is not fair. Specifically, if we are talking in terms of privacy or maybe in related context, so fairness would be something like the output of your system, right? Or what action do you want to do? It should not harm a particular subgroup. That is how I would define something as fair. And now fair is like, if we take it in today's context, right? So let's say you go to buy an airplane ticket and you will be charged more than somebody else. So is that fair? So I will say that is fair because you're not harming somebody else bought because of the limited quantity. But if you are doing harmful activities or if you're harming somebody based on societal positions or how much money they make or some other factor, then I will call that unfair. So we need to define these fairness parameters based on some criteria so that people have an equal opportunity and they can still gain the output of the AI product or systems we create for tomorrow.
Piotr, anything to add?
Sorry, no, that was pretty much aligned with how I see it. Obviously, when fairness and bias are and ethics, for myself at least, they kind of go hand in hand. There's the blurred area in between them, right? So when we talk about any ML and AI, has to be opaque in the sense we have to understand how decisions are made. It has to exclude any, for example, gender, ethnicity, all those various aspects, or maybe your postal code or whatnot. That has to be eroded. That has to be kind of accounted for in the data when it comes to training the machine learning model, as well as when we look at the predictions, right? So very aligned, kind of, we were thinking the same direction here. How about yourself, Mike?
Oh, I absolutely 100% agree. I would also want everybody to keep in mind that fairness is subjective, right? So you have to kind of ground yourself into some sort of an axiom or some sort of an assumption. And the axiom that I personally use is no two AI systems are going to be the same, right? AI systems are unique. They're tailored. They're so customized to the use case or the application that they're designed for. So hence, fairness criteria will also be customized and tailored to the application. And there are generalized frameworks that we can use. There's like the OECD trustworthy principles and many others. I use them. I know a lot of my clients use them. They can help, but to a certain degree. They can help you define fairness, but when it comes to quantifying fairness or controlling fairness or taking that corrective action, I think it needs to be customized precisely to what this AI was designed for. But definitely with you guys there. Awesome. So Piotr, I really liked what you said about fairness just now. I wanna bring your perspective a little bit to the general governance of AI. what are the main drivers behind governance of AI today?
Okay, so AI is a hype word, ML, right? It's been around for a while. I mean, most of us are interacting with AI machine learning. But this right now, the way with the evolution, explosion of AI and its infusion into, let's say, any kind of client-facing businesses. So let's take finance, but let's go even more with government services or more critical with healthcare, right? With all that, this is a new technology that has still lots of unknowns and things that we're kind of feeling reserved about. So what do we need to care? Like the main drivers behind governance in AI, compliance. First of all, whenever institution introduces an AI model, are they compliant with them when the AI makes a decision? It makes a business decision that can affect human lives. Let's be clear about that, right? I mean, self-driving cars is an excellent example, right? So first of all, compliance and security is relevant, and regulations, following legal regulations of a specific industry, right? So that's one aspect, right? One pillar. Second pillar is a trust. And that is critical, right? Right now, for us, with the AI models are often abstracted. So when I'm browsing Netflix or I'm going to Amazon to shop, obviously this is being recommendations engine, right? This is well trained. This is traditional machine learning, right? But we're moving into much higher spaces, much more complex models and much more complex use cases. So will I trust a doctor whose decision will be augmented by a neural network model that, for example, can look for early signs of cancer in imagery, right? So will I trust that, right? Now, and the last one that is driven is efficiency. Okay, obviously, businesses don't invest in AI just because it seems cool. They obviously want to look for new business opportunities, improvement in existing processes, and the way they conduct business within their own organizations, as well as increasing the whole customer experience. So compliance, because obviously that's critical for every large institution. Trust from the AI model that towards our consumers of this technology, and finally, efficiency that's driving kind of adoption AI into our businesses. Perhaps a limited view, however, those would be like the core three principles I see personally when interacting with our clients and speaking on conferences, so on and so forth, the driving reasons for the governance in it.
No, absolutely, Peter. That's what I'm seeing as well. And there's a slight undertone of competition in there as well, right? Because when we're talking about trust, these organizations are competing for trust, for consumer trust. They're competing with each other for efficiency. So I like what you said there. When we talk about governance of AI, AI is a big, solution with many little moving parts, and a big part there is the data itself, because that is the key ingredient for AI. So when we are evaluating data specifically for quality, for that could be bias, cleanliness, availability, how can we strike the right balance between accuracy or truth and fairness? For example, I ask this because there is a lot of talk about, and it's a little bit controversial, about synthetic data, using synthetic data to offset bias. But the question is, at what point does that become, a fake representation of our population? Prashant, any thoughts?
Yeah, so that is correct. Like we are evolving more into like new ways to generate synthetic data to offset, so we can hide, some privacy information of a specific individual or a group. So two problems. One is synthetic data is expensive to compute. And second is it might not have the same complex pattern which you might be looking in a real life data. So we are still working on some of these problems. It's not done yet. There are other areas like homomorphic encryption and others which people are looking into. So in terms of the quality of data, as I said, so it depends on the feature which you have extracted out of your AI product, which you use as your input and output. So if some of the feature is actually relying on somebody's privacy information or extracting a feature out of it, so that is one concern. Second is if you are using, let's say, somebody's race or ethnicity or gender, like these kind of information, and deriving an output, that could cause to unfair practices. So when you are evaluating your data, like what all features you're extracting or looking into, that needs to be like your model has to be accountable for what all features does it rely on, or what is the weight of these features, right? Otherwise, it might not be a fair model. So that is one. The other aspect for data quality, so like it should be clean data, how much available it is. So it's a fine boundary. We are now looking at, like, especially the deep learning models, because we are collecting a lot of data. Like 80% of the data we collect today is unstructured. And this includes like IoT data. Like whenever you do any action on a mobile phone, it generates a lot of data. And without knowingly, we can consume this data and do an inference or a reference about or recommendation on what you are supposed to do next. So companies have to look into like practices, like how this data quality can be maintained. How do we ensure that this is the right representation of a particular user? And instead of hoarding all this information, we might have to pick and choose what our models can do and what they cannot, to restrict the use cases. Because if you want to try to tackle and you run into an unbalanced data set, you might develop a model which is basically biased, depending on this use case scenario. Yeah. Peter?
Yes, I'm just itching to chime in. And, I like how you actually got into the parameters and hyperparameterization, all this stuff, but I would like to actually take it a little bit higher.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say no amount of work and dedication is enough to actually sacrifice fairness and bias. We need to erode that. We need to remove that. And actually, I like when Maya started talking about data. I'm going to even go like as a starting point for machine learning. I'm going to be actually more open. There's no AI and ML without data. Outside of that, you guys, all we got is a fancy algorithms, okay? So everything is in data. It is also super important to recognize that as a society, over the decades, we have evolved, right? We're on the right path as a society. However, our historical data, which is precisely what we're going to use to train the models and give a prediction for the future, okay, is full of bias. It is full of ethnic injustice. It is full of racial discrimination, so on and so forth. Okay, so gender, racial, the data is full. Now, another aspect that I always like to call out, without basically elimination of bias and cleaning this data, the models will only amplify the bias. So as simple as that. So if the data contains the bias actually, and basically this inequality, okay, the model will actually amplify it. So this is one of the aspects where I think that industry and everybody else should be super focused on. So yes, if I have to generate, and obviously attributes like gender, like ethnicity, like where you're from, your education, all these kind of aspects, right? There's all these various aspects. They need to be eroded. They need to be removed. Yes, if it takes us to create synthetic data and it's going to cost us something, fine. But there is no way around that. Sorry, I just need to tell you, so no AI, no ML about data. Data has inherited bias without us cleansing it and putting governance around it. This is actually part of this kind of cleansing, that they're removing a bias, is actually one of the principles that I was speaking about, trust, right? So that's why we need governance, because we need trust. And yes, we need to eliminate our, the past, the last whatever decades of the past, so we don't amplify it. And our machine learning solutions, and what we actually put in front of people, are free from it. Sorry, this is what this one I'm really feeling passionate about. So
No, I'm really glad you did, Peter, because this is, I think everybody needs to take this away, and you articulated it perfectly. And I want everybody to keep in mind that we don't just dive right into synthetic data generation right away. There are a lot of steps data scientists take and a lot of data quality techniques that we use. And then, if necessary, we get into synthetic data generation. And a lot of times it's simply not necessary. Sometimes we can just, oversample, undersample. There are ways we can avoid doing that. But know that synthetic data generation is mostly used to offset a known bias. When we are sure and we know that this exists, we use it to offset that, or we use it to test a machine that's already been trained. Ideally, we don't train on synthetic data. We only use it in an evaluative capacity for testing purposes. And there's a lot of value in doing that, because what we're ultimately trying to do is we're trying to make fair decisions, or at least better decisions. And through those better decisions, we're trying to generate new actual data that is now inclusive and less biased over time. So we simply eliminate, ideally, the need for synthetic data. But until then, there is a lot of value in, like you said, Peter, we have to manually step in and we have to correct historical flaws, but with caution, of course, and keep that scope very tight. We can't just let synthetic data mix and mingle with actual data. We have to keep that scope very, very tight. Peter, back to you. Can you outline some key practices or some processes
Yep.
in the AI ML lifecycle that lead to a strong AI governance?
Yes. So first of all, there's misconceptions that AI ML is easy. And you know what? When you think about, okay, you take a data scientist, you give him some, open source data set, whip up a recommendation engine in a couple of days, okay? But that's not what it means of putting machine learning in production, okay? And that's not even putting machine learning in production, doesn't even account for all the steps that the AI governance guarantees and requires for us to do. So let's start with the whole origin of data, okay? We need to understand that as a part of AI governance, your tracking starts with the origin of the data itself, understanding of the data, understanding the model and associated metadata and pipelines, so they allow for you, this has to be persisted, documented, and accessible in the case of the audit. Okay, again, we just got some data, I don't know what happened there, but so no. Okay, so first of all, origin of data, models, metadata associated with it. Now, not only that, documentation should include, AI governance should include the techniques that were used to train the model, right? How about hyperparameters that were used? How about the matrix for testing, for each testing phase? How those matrices were done? Now, then this this kind of documentation is increasing the transparency of the model's behavior. We need to be able to explain. I mean, if I'm a banking customer, I'm going to apply for a loan and the model is going to tell me, no, just go away. And I'm going to call my bank advisor. I would like to be able to explain what the hell just happened. Right? So not even that. So transparency throughout the full life cycle. And guys, it's so important to recognize that this starts with perhaps even data engineering, granting you access to data repositories. There might be governance aspect to it when you're actually doing reduction, masking of sensitive information. And then you have your own AI machine learning techniques, and then you have your whole pipelines of putting this in production. And then how about model drift and the decay? So we're talking about this vicious, I used to call it vicious circle of ML, because this never ends. The development and deployment of a machine learning model is a circular process. And the governance has to be present over there, not only from the beginning to the completion of the cycle, but also. Now, how it's important? Well, the data drift, the basic data changes, underlying data changes. The customers, the users start exhibiting new behaviors. The models have to adjust to that, right? So we need to have a clear process, and governance, data governance, AI governance actually does that exactly, to outline this flow, this life cycle with assets that are generated upon each of the phases. Assets that can be then reference, that can be auditable, and then actually satisfy our regulatory requests. All right, I hope this is a super complex process, and putting it into kind of words and this kind of mental visualization is sometimes challenging. Okay, so basically, it's a circular process with multiple of the stages. Each stage is producing variety of assets. So origins of data, associated metadata, documentation of techniques, how you train the model, explainability, how the model is giving those predictions that it is. Okay, finally, monitoring for decay, biases, so on and so forth in a continuous fashion. All right, that's a 1,000-foot level.
No, Peter, I like that you, instead of just giving a brand new framework or one more thing for people to remember, you brought us back to the ML lifecycle that everybody knows and uses already. And I am a strong believer in keeping processes and frameworks as simple as possible. So when I talk to clients about modernizing, I like to repurpose what's already in use. And what's already in use is the ML ops or model ops, whatever we want to call it, industry standard CI/CD methodology that you just mentioned. So I agree, you can leverage the exact same life cycle that you're already using to develop and deploy AI. Start where it starts, right? Start at the data and embed your data governance right there. Put your guardrails right at that stage, your privacy, your sensitivity flags, your data quality alerts, your data health dashboards, embed them where data engineering is happening. Move on to the next phase, feature engineering, move on to the next stage, machine learning, embed explainability there. So follow the life cycle or the circle that Peter's mentioning and just start layering on governance on top of that. And hopefully you're going to be fine. Basically bring it where you're developing, right? Bring the governance where the work is happening. No, absolutely. I think that's so important for people to understand, because when they think of governance, they think they have to now design a brand new thing and bring in, new consultants and implement new frameworks. And it's like, you can repurpose the framework that you're using already. On that note, Prashant, let's come back to specifically fairness, measuring, monitoring fairness. What technology mechanisms, what specific techniques exist today that can be used to measure fairness in AI and ML?
So for fairness, there are not too many. So I'll be speaking in terms of specific libraries. For fairness, they're not, most of the fairness scores which are generated, they are custom or in-house, and because it's industry or vertical specific. There are a few libraries which have evolved in the past. Like one of them is like CapTerm, then Microsoft has a new one called Interpret ML, and there are a bunch of others. So these libraries, they either use like feature engineering, or you can actually use like a gradient-based tracing, or you can do a kernel-based tracing to figure out whether this is biased or fair. And you can do internal traceability to figure it out, like how much is each feature contributing, right? So these are some of the libraries available. Some of the disadvantage of these libraries are that when you are creating your models, you have to embed these as part of the model. They can't act like a black box. The only way you can introduce something outside is you can collect some data, dump it into a matrix, and then you can do your statistical analysis out of your system. So that is another way to tackle the problem of bias and fairness. For doing something like this, I would basically say that start with keep your features simple, very simple, that you can, instead of taking, like tens of thousands of hyperparameters as input, keep them simple, maybe create them as groups. So you can explain what is the factor, or what is, let's say, the odds ratio of a particular group, right? And what is the impact on the overall bias and fairness. So the way I would recommend people doing this is like create like a fairness and bias quality of score for your systems, and then explain how each feature is contributing to that. And then you can version your models over a period of time, and then you can measure it across. As there will be like a concept drift or a data drift coming in, and your models will get aged. So the bias and fairness quality metrics have to be changed accordingly. And for those, you basically have to write like a canary test or something running in production, which is evaluating this constantly as the number of users are coming in, or whatever data you're collecting. So as the data changes, you might have to detect like what has changed, and then get alerted on top of it. Yeah.
That is great advice. Very, very practical. Thank you for that. I hope everybody was making notes. On that same note, and you were smiling and nodding a lot.
It's my goodness. I love it how we actually went from this high, ethics, fairness, all this kind of stuff, looking at the scope. And then we have Prashant is just like, let's get coding. I'm surprised he didn't pull up the terminal over here and show them how it's done. So.
But I do have a follow-up question for both you, Prashant, and Peter. While we're talking about the tangible, the pragmatic side of things, do you have any tips, practical tips, to set up AI ML maturity and governance using perhaps real-world examples for data scientists and business leaders? And we can start with you, Prashant.
Sure. So the way I have done it in the past, so forget like fairness and bias. Like when I was doing some AI products, so we had to explain this to the customer. Like this is, let's say, a price recommendation product. So we have to explain to the customer like why we are pricing a certain product at that price point in a certain time frame, or for a particular demographic, right? So the number one thing is you need to have explainability. And depending on what you're using, whether you're using an statistics-based model or you're using a deep learning model, you have to build some traceability inside your model, so you should be able to explain to the customer. If you're using like a multi-layer model, which has like multiple processes involved or multiple data layers, so for each of those you need to have some traceability. So that is the first step. Second is you need to have your, means that without that, like as Peter said, you cannot deploy something by copying code, and it has to be versioned. And as part of the versioning, you need to keep track of what is the expected input and the output, so you can have some fairness and bias quality scores for your data. If the data changes, I will say let the model fail. and then you get alerted on it and try to address. Because if you make a bad decision, like if you're a cancer patient, and if you make a bad decision, it's better to fail rather than giving a wrong diagnosis. So that is a fair thing. And finally, like as the third one, you need to set up monitoring. It has to be real-time alerting. So this monitoring, what it is doing is, it is essentially looking for data drifts. It is looking for concept drifts. And that is not easy to do. It is very hard to do. But as you come across more use cases where your, let's say, your accuracy dies or your F1 score deviates, so that's where you can get alerted. So explainability, versioning, and monitoring, like these are the three things I would advise anybody to set up, like get ready get ready for a model in production, actually, not only for bias vendors, but for other use cases too. Yeah, Peter.
Oh, okay. So this is actually cool because I want to go from a different angle. It always what happens is, like we throw in a new term, we say neural network, deep learning, like everybody's, oh, I want to do that. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, most of the business use cases that I see with customers working on, okay, can be satisfied with traditional machine learning. Supervised, unsupervised learning, k-means clustering, linear regression. Guys, do not try to invest in the GPU machines that cost you so much and they say neural network, because this is the hype right now. It is not needed. I'm going to stand here and say 80 to 90% of your use cases, traditional machine learning, well-defined stuff that doesn't cost you arm and a leg. That's the first statement, okay? Now, actually, I like what Chantal said, is that you need to explain stuff. Let's be very clear. With every level of the network, explainability disappears. We don't know what's going on over there. Let's be like, I'm going to say out there, you're going to get 10 levels deep, you don't know what's going on in that network and how the model made that decision. Or if you want to know, it's a tremendous amount of work to do it. Again, traditional machine learning algorithms, we know how to explain those things, all right? So if I'm going to have a algorithm that I know how to work with, that can satisfy 90% of my use cases, focus on that. And a deep learning stuff for concentrations, okay, yes, you need a neural network. I'm not going to say no. But those are very specific use cases, okay? Another aspect, another pitfall that I see customers often making in clients is that they think machine learning is easy. The first statement I made, the statement that I made actually earlier stages, right? And they say, oh, I'm going to hire a couple of people. There's so many brilliant new graduates. They all want to do data science. And I'm going to tell them, I got some business problems, or there's my data. Let's just throw it in there. Let's just throw it in there and see what happens, see what sticks. And then you go through a year or two without recognizing value for the business. Make sure that you start clearly with the business statement you're trying to solve, choosing the best machine learning framework and a model type for that problem to solve. This is when we go through traditional machine learning versus deep learning neural networks, okay? Then do not try to develop all frameworks by yourself. And what was mentioned, okay, you need to have a model version, excellent. You need to have a model repository, great. You need to have a deployment service. Yes, it has to create REST APIs, it has to be secure. You need the auditable capabilities. But then how about continuous learning aspects? How about retraining of this model? How about testing for bias? And then you have to do the governance. So I don't want to make it an IBM pitch, because yes, we happen to have a model development platforms and model deployment platforms. And yes, we had actually help you with bias and drift detection out of the box. Okay, doesn't have to be IBM, but take a look at what is best out there and do not spend all your resources trying to create the frameworks that allow you to work with the full lifecycle management of the model development and deployment and management. It took us years to do it with a couple hundred people. It's non-trivial. So here are the pitfalls, right? You don't have a clear use case business propositions, like what you're trying to get out of the data. You just throw the data in there, see what happens. Then you go after next shiny object, which is deep learning, machine learning, all this stuff. No, you can do it, most of the stuff with this. And then, by the way, your data scientists, they're not necessarily DevOps pipeline developers. They can actually create those platforms for you. They don't do that. You need different people for this. Okay, so those are my three advices, not to be outdone here, that I would say for every enterprise, everybody that's trying to embrace the AI, infuse them in the new businesses, do not fall in those three pitfalls. Okay, thank you.
So basically, simpler is better. You do not always need. Yes. Simpler is better because it costs less. It is easier to explain to leaders and regulators, and it takes less compute power. And secondly, you're saying, and I think this is so important, don't try to reinvent the wheel. you do not have to do everything by yourself. There's a lot of stuff out in the market, and even some free stuff. If you're very open source friendly, there is a lot you can leverage. You do not have to take that onto yourself. So thank you, Prashant and Peter, both for these very, very practical data science tips. Let's come a little bit to senior leadership. Let's think, the C-suite. What tips do you have for senior leadership who may not always be in the nitty-gritty of the data science? What tips do you have for these leaders around setting up a governance framework?
Oh, Prashant. No, yeah, we're both thinking, huh? We're both thinking. Let's buy us our time. Let's smile and think. Oh boy, that's a tough one.
Because one thing that comes up often is, these leadership is not always down in the trenches. They don't know, what techniques we're using, what algorithms we're using, but they want to put together, either a governing body or sometimes a committee, a governing committee with representation from all around the business that kind of, has a say in how this algorithm should be used. Are our customers being affected positively or negatively? So it's little efforts like that, I think, at that level that make a big difference.
I would say that definitely have understanding that machine learning development models is not it. Governance is a critical part, and for every enterprise, governance to be every step of the way through your machine learning lifecycle development, deployment, and management. Okay, that's simple. It's just that. Again, do not try to reinvent the wheel, because lots of governance mechanisms that we use already on business analytics software, deep analytics, let's use big data or something like that. We already have governance mechanisms, okay, that work for data reduction, okay, policies enforcement, business rules enforcement, all this kind of stuff that can help you cleanse your data, that can help you ensure that what your data scientists have is already, has any sensitive information removed, right? Now, so build on your own existing governance frameworks, because machine learning is not as different as other software development. At this point, I lead the DB2, right? Relational theory, relational database, 30 years strong, and leading with enterprise software. We have governance processes in place. When I look how they evolved, and yes, they did evolve, don't get me wrong, because there's so many nuances, uniqueness in the whole AI space and ML space. However, use your foundation that you have and expand it and see what is the best of breed when it comes to solutions, governance solutions for AI, and what are the best practices. And make sure you understand that AI and ML and governance go hand in hand. And to be frank, we should not have one without the other. All right, that would be from myself.
Okay. I think I would recommend for the leadership to actually invest in, creating this governance body, as Peter said. I think every company need to put some effort and time into this. And governance doesn't only come from like the engineering or the data science team, but it will also involve your marketing team. It will also come from your privacy or legal counsel. The reason is because there are different regulations which engineers are typically not aware about. Let's say there are like telecommunication laws in Europe that you cannot move the MAC address out of one country to another. And engineers typically don't know about this, but somebody can create a model which relies on that MAC address. So these things can happen. Today we have issues about cross-country data transfers, right? I cannot move data out of Canada or Europe to a US database.
Yep.
So you need to invest in a governance body which can actually talk about what is the data that could be used, what is not used. So that is one. But if you run into a scenario, let's say that we have to use this data, let's say some IoT data, we need it for our AI model, then the leader has to think about what is the risk associated, right? And how can we mitigate the risk? So there are frameworks available, like there is this, let's say you're collecting a lot of images, right? So you can do like a bystander privacy framework or other mechanisms so that you only use the data which you want. Data minimization is good because you can make yourself accountable. Less features are good, simple models are good. So the leader has to, invest into creating this governance body and make your team accountable. Like, hey, how did you derive at that? Because your customers will be asking you the same questions. How did you do this? So, and if you're making life and death decision, then it becomes more critical. So you better be accountable. So I'll say invest into a team, put strong leaders who make everybody accountable in the company, involve multiple departments, because only engineering or maybe infrastructure cannot solve this. You need multiple perspective in this. Create a diverse team, it will help you. And that way you can ensure that all the products you're developing, it minimizes your risk, and you have a better outcome and trust with your customers. All right, May?
Yeah, I think absolutely agree. And I think we're coming to the conversation of org culture a little bit towards the end. We did get there. The responsibility of cultivating a certain culture will always sit with leadership. And I think that's where they do play this really, really big role of investing in literacy, let's say. It's not just the data scientists and the technical teams. It's not just their job to know what good data practices, what to share, what not to share. I think basic AI and data literacy is something that everybody in an AI-enabled organization needs to be aware of. And like you said, it could be marketing, it could be operations. Everybody needs to know what type of data do we carry and how am I interacting with it and what good data practices. The second thing I think that leadership needs to take ownership of is the values, ethics charter, you can call it. What your people cannot uphold values that have not been defined for them. Same way, your data scientists don't know what's fair or ethical for our industry unless they have it written down somewhere, unless it has been spelled out for them. So I think it does that responsibility of defining our values and our ethics criteria. I think that still sits with leadership as well, because that's what's going to trickle down in the form of culture, right?
That's actually very, very, very interesting point, Maya, and that actually would bring me to a different type of question. Since we're about 9 minutes left, we got about 9 minutes left. So you mentioned the fairness and all this kind of ethics. It belongs in the hands of the corporation. Now, so do you believe that it is fine for the corporations, individual corporations, to dictate how AI is done, and it will be up to them to decide that the models that they produce, okay, are fair, non-biased, and they're fine with it? So, or is there chance, or there should be some level of government oversight, okay, to create the standards for governance and deployment and usage of AI models, and especially in sensitive industries, and finance, healthcare, those come to mind, like any kind of government institutions, anything that actually affects lots of people. So we have, let's say, two trains of thought, or even three possible solutions. Yes, we leave it to the CEOs to figure out, or whatever, the C-suite. Each enterprise does their own thing. Or we have a federal government step in and create some kind of a standard for governance and AI usage. Or we leave it to basically industry leaders to form some level of a consortium. Let's say we will look Google, IBM, Microsoft. I don't want to exclude anybody, but let's just say, so I don't have a list of 100. So let's say Google, IBM, Microsoft, okay? The leaders in AI, okay? And so should they be doing this? So what do you guys think? Because I don't want to finish the session without getting your minds on this one.
No, you're really starting something here, Peter. Let me just, for ease of discussion, I'm just going to label roles. There are two types of roles in the question that you've asked. There is the players, which are these technology companies and industry leaders. Then there is the authority. And these authorities could be the government, it could be a different party, but we need federal oversight and standards, at least for fair use and protection of data and protection of citizens. Now, it is also important to know that this alone is not enough. Regulations alone are never enough. This is only what this federal oversight does is simply going to be regulatory action, and it cannot and it will not replace the need for industry-specific frameworks for trustworthy or fair AI or well-governed AI. And I think that piece needs to come from neutral parties. There are a lot of organizations, even currently, like the Responsible AI Institute and many other credible organizations, that are developing frameworks specifically for that, right? These are neutral parties. That's what I call them. We can never leave governance to industry leaders, because governance, it cannot and should not come from players themselves. There's a conflict of interest there. That's simply not ethically sustainable. what industry leaders can do, I think they do have a big role to play. What they can do is set best practices. They can set examples. They can cultivate thought leadership, put out resources, and lead by example. But authority and players have to be two different things, two different bodies. That's what I think.
Interesting. So if I hear you correctly, definitely, so you believe there should be federal oversight, okay? However, the industry leaders should be basically kind of dictating standards we should be following, right? But wouldn't you think that industry leaders would be more self-serving? And when we talk about federal, there could be differences between each country, how they, I don't want to be pointing out, but you know what, everybody's watching news. How about what's happening in the Taliban situation in Afghanistan, right? I mean, it's atrocity. It's atrocity. And when some countries, and we have policies, the government, you know, the policies that actually discriminate, let me just be transparent, like they discriminate against women or whatever, you know what? So I would think, personally, that there should be a global consortium of, like, I don't know, WHO. WHO might be not the best one, but let's go with the G7, so on and so forth, right? That the standards there are defined, especially around ethics, especially around bias, okay, and discrimination within AI should be defined on that level. And those kind of basic rules that actually do treat everybody the same and ensure that, for example, bias is removed from a model as a part of the development lifecycle. You have to have the proof that you actually removed it. I don't care what it costs, right? That should be dictated by the bigger government body. And then the industry leaders would be, you know, kind of implementing those within the scope of their own industry, basically, pillar. All right, so sorry, again, just like yourself, I see your eyes just sparked, and it's like, oh yeah, I want to talk about this. That's kind of my opinion. Sorry about it. I didn't mean to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to exclude Prashant from the discussion. Prashant, yourself, please tell me, what do you think?
Yeah, no worries. I'm just listening to you guys. Okay. I think my opinion is that so if you have all the industry leaders, because they have a common interest, so they'll collude with each other, of course, if you want to create an interest, right? So we kind of need a neutral body. The issue is that the government doesn't have AI ML experts. They are good at, like, maybe looking at the legal regulation, right? And then what is fair ethics, and then you have the industry itself. So I think we should maybe go for a kind of like a neutral body, and it needs to have both the industry leaders and maybe somebody either from government but not from the industry itself. So
academia. I'm speaking out loud.
Academia is fine.
Research, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So we need to have a body which has both, and so this body can then make everybody accountable. Like a good example of this is for advertising. You have IAB, and IAB has the standards, and now you'll see they're talking about some consent management based standards today. So we need some body like this which can be neutral. On the government side, so I will say, like, each government can pass their own, like there can be a global standard and each government can take pieces of that. But on the government side, the government need to basically enforce the standards. What we find is, okay, the law is passed, but there is no budget or there is no authority to actually have somebody accountable for that. So those mechanisms have to be created. Unless those mechanisms exist, like, okay, people will still be creating models which are biased, fair, like nobody will care. So we need to have some accountability. We need to have some enforcement for this to work.
Awesome. Oh.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're almost at time, and I know we all have, I could tell, Peter, you have a lot more to say, and I do too.
It's okay.
But given that we only have 90 seconds left with our audience, any parting thoughts from both of you or either of you?
Yeah, I think from my side, I think this is fairly new, but even though the government, whether the laws are passed or not, but I would advise everybody, especially like the leadership and even engineering, to be more proactive on whether the models you work on, think about if they're harming somebody, or how they could harm somebody. And maybe in your daily practice, talk to somebody, like, what are the different privacy regulation? Why do we need to worry about bias or fairness or ethics? And educate yourself. So instead of somebody telling you what to do, you can actually decide what kind of model do you want to create for a fair and fair world. Actually, it will not only help you, but there are generations coming after you, right? So they'll help all of us. So that is my advice.
No, I'm there with the Prashant. I'm gonna take 10 seconds. AI is here to stay. It's intertwined in our lives to the point many of them don't realize. There should be no AI without governance, period. And this has to start with industry leaders. It has to start with individual enterprises. So I hope everybody understands that, because we're building our future, right? And thank you, everybody. And hey, our LinkedIn things are on our profiles. Reach out. We can continue these conversations after. And Mai, I want to thank you. You've been awesome. Like, Mai just stepped in as a moderator. We had the moderator, basically not being able to make the session, and you've done a tremendous job. So bravo to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Prashant. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, May. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Peter.